Okay, so we will continue with a new perspective. So Paul Thompson is next. Paul Thompson holds the Kellogg Chair in Agricultural, Food, and Community Ethics at Michigan State University, where he has a joint appointment in two colleges, the Colleges of Arts and Letters and the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. He serves on the faculty in 3 different departments, so already we get a sense of the multidisciplinary nature of his thinking, right? The philosophy department, community sustainability, and agricultural, food, and resource economics. His research centers on ethical and philosophical questions associated with agriculture and food, including those related to the development and use of biotechnology. As endowed chair, Dr. Thompson provides sort of a moral perspective, and he has sparked dialogue across disciplines on ethical questions that scientists face. In his educational approach, he combines science with community engagement, ethical analysis, and he's explored topics ranging from natural resource protection, sustainable agriculture and food safety, to animal welfare and organic farming. His leadership has inspired collaboration between colleges at the university to find sustainable solutions to problems posed by present-day agricultural practices and global food production. He has dedicated basically a lifetime of philosophical rigor to articulating worldviews and assumptions underlying our use of technology, and to advocating for a more holistic assessment of if, when, and how it should be applied. So this is the other part of the equation where Dr. McEwen left off. We pick up with Dr. Thompson. Dr. Thompson began actually as a mathematics major, but he ended up earning a BA in philosophy from Emory University and then continued with an MA and a PhD in philosophy from SUNY at Stony Brook. So he sort of follows in the great tradition of deep thinking and philosophy that comes out of mathematics. Before making Michigan State his home, Dr. Thompson held positions at Texas A&M University as professor of philosophy and agricultural economics and a director of the Center for Science and Technology, Policy, and Ethics. I love these huge names of these institutes. And also held positions at Purdue University as distinguished professor of philosophy and, again, a director for the Center for Food Animal Productivity and Well-Being. Dr. Thompson is the author or co-author of over 200 articles in refereed journals or scholarly books. He published the first book-length philosophical treatment of agricultural biotechnology way back there in 1997. It was revised and re-edited in 2007. He has given invited talks around the world on this subject. He has also published extensively on the ethical and social significance of agriculture. So in 1992, his book in 1992 with 4 co-authors on U.S. agricultural policy, it's called Sacred Cows and Hot Potatoes, like that, was used as a textbook for congressional staffers and won the American Agricultural Economics Association Award for excellence in communication. A second book, From Field to Fork, Food Ethics for Everyone, was a 2015 Book of the Year for the North American Society for Social Philosophy. In the words of one reviewer, it is, quote, the first comprehensive study to explore interconnections hidden deep within this welter of issues. Thompson not only brings a comprehensive philosophical approach to moral issues in the production, processing, distribution, and consumption of food, he introduces a fresh way to think about practical ethics. And then finally, his 1995 book, I like this title too, The Spirit of the Soil, Agriculture and Environmental Ethics, was released in an updated edition in 2017. And to quote a different reviewer, The Spirit of the Soil is still among the only works in philosophy that accords agriculture the weight it deserves within the field of environmental ethics. The clarity of Thompson's arguments, the depth and carefulness of his historical scholarship, and the attentiveness with which he takes up arguments of critics make it impossible for me to do anything other than re-examine and reconstruct my own position. So finally, Dr. Thompson has served on advisory boards for the USDA, the U.S. National Research Council, the U.S. National Academy of Engineering, and Genome Canada. He has received fellowships from the Council on Foreign Relations, the Hastings Center, and Yale University. He was a founding member and second president of the Agriculture, Food, and Human Values Society, which honored him with the Distinguished Career Contribution in Research Award in 2013. And in 2017, Thompson received the William J. Beale Award for Outstanding Faculty from Michigan State University and the Don Ide. Is it Don Ide? I was afraid of that. And the Don Ide Prize for Distinguished Achievement by a Philosophy PhD graduate of the State University of New York at Stony Brook. So join me in welcoming Dr. Thompson.
Thank you. Well, it is a pleasure to be here. See if I can get my presentation to pop up here. So it's up on the little computer here, but it's not up on the screen. Is there something else I need to do? There it goes. Okay, good. Yeah, so this is a really boring title. I apologize for that. Especially after Sacred Cows and Hot Potatoes and the Spirit of the Soil. I surely could have come up with something more thought-provoking than this. So hopefully the presentation won't be quite so uninspired. Let me see here if I can, what I needed to do. There we go. So I am going to kind of talk about some other things before I really get to the GMO stuff. And partly what I've kind of designed the talk to raise some issues that we probably should talk about in the question and answer period. So I won't talk in a lot of detail about this, but if people are interested in it, they're sort of make a note of that and ask a question about it. Then we'll say a few things about the GMO controversy. I've studied the GMO controversy since the mid-1980s. Well, real quick biographical note, I wrote my dissertation in the 1970s on nuclear power and risk assessment, and landed at Texas A&M, and the Dean of Agriculture wanted somebody to teach a course on ethics in agriculture, and I said, well, I don't really know anything about agriculture, but maybe I can sort of take some of this stuff I've been thinking about with respect to technology and risk, and the biotech stuff was kind of dumped in my lap. So I have really worked out a lot of my thinking on technology and risk and its social significance, much more with biotech than with some of the energy technologies that I started out with. So I'll talk a little bit about the controversy, bring up some things, and then hopefully I can finish and leave plenty of time for some questions. So some of the things that I could say, I think when a philosopher gets introduced, the main thing that they're sort of expected to talk about is this notion of things that are problems with the technology that might be the result of a risk or something that bad that might happen, an unanticipated consequence. That's what we sometimes call an extrinsic question. And then is there something about what you're doing here that's kind of intrinsically wrong? I'm not going to talk about that, right? If you're interested in it, we'll get back to it in the question and answer period, but it'll probably be fairly obvious that I don't think genetic engineering is intrinsically wrong, especially not in an agricultural context, right? I'm not going to talk about the precautionary principle and why it doesn't apply in this case. Precautionary principle is this idea that until that you sort of are cautious about using a technology, even if you really don't know what the risks are, because you might mess something up, right? And I think it doesn't apply in this case in a nutshell, because we're dealing with a system that has a lot of problems already, right? As Dr. McEwen mentioned, there's a certain sense in which even 10,000 years ago, when they started dramatically simplifying ecosystems with agriculture, we created a system that was, in a certain sense, out of balance, and it's required constant adjustment ever since. In the 20th century, we've started using chemicals both for fertilization and we've started using chemicals for pest control. Both of these are associated with health and environmental effects. we're not dealing with a system that we have a lot of confidence that it's performing well or would continue to perform well in the future. So in a nutshell, I think the precautionary arguments, although they've been influential in Europe, really are just sort of philosophically misplaced with respect to agriculture. I would have a little more interest in giving this talk, and I do give this talk. I think some of this was implied in what Dr. McEwen said. In a lot of respects, people bring these worries to biotech, and they're not unreasonable worries. There are risks and issues, but in many respects, what's happening is that people are learning about some of the problems that we have with agriculture generally through the biotech debate, and they get to a room full of people that are working with agriculture on a day-to-day basis, and gosh, this is just as true of ordinary crop breeding as it is of biotech. And so there's a certain sense in which people have become so disconnected from agriculture that they are just kind of not aware of some of the intrinsic risks of what we do on a daily basis, producing food and then consuming it. So there's a certain sense in which this debate has brought some genuine issues to people's attention, but what they haven't realized is that it's much bigger than biotech. And then I could talk about some of the philosophical and ethical gaps in the regulatory system, and I'm not going to get into that in any detail, primarily because they apply not just to genetically engineered crops, but to conventionally bred crops, and again, it's just kind of a subset of the previous talk. So here's a talk I would like to give, and in fact I am going to sort of give a really abbreviated version of this talk. It's my philosophy of agriculture talk, and what it's basically thinking about what we really want from agriculture. What do we expect agriculture to do for us? And in a simple way, oversimplification, I would suggest that there are kind of two competing philosophies out there, one of which suggests that agriculture is an industrial platform, and the other which really suggests that it has a lot of other features that mean that it really suggests that we shouldn't think about it in the same way that we think about other kinds of technological platforms. So this notion of agriculture as an industrial platform, the idea is that like any other sector of the economy, manufacturing, financial services, information tech, healthcare, the entertainment industry, you name it, right? The productive capabilities of the agricultural platform should be steered by consumer demand for their products and should satisfy that demand as efficiently as possible while controlling external costs. Now that's kind of a mouthful in itself, so let's unpack it a little bit. One of the key ideas here is that we're thinking about a sector of the economy. The sector that we're talking about includes farmers, of course, but it also includes the supporting industries, the people that manufacture the tractors and the fertilizers and the seeds, and that are key to farming and agricultural practice. When we focus on it being steered by consumer demand, what we mean is that decisions about what we use this platform to produce are going to be made in response to markets. So farmers are going to grow things that they can sell, and the industries that support farmers are going to make things that they can sell to farmers. And then this should be done efficiently. That means that everybody benefits when prices are low, or to put it in economic speak, markets should be competitive. Okay? And however, there is an important constraint on this, and that is that we really do not increase efficiencies or lower prices in ways that impose costs on third parties, or in other words, do something that harms them, right? So it's not okay to make a product that's going to make people sick or kill them. We do put some constraints on markets. So it's important to recognize that there is a social ethic at work here, there are things that you can't do, there are things that you should do, but the point that I really want to stress is that it's really treating agriculture like every other sector in our economy. And we would ask very similar questions. Are you producing efficiently? Are you getting some sort of favoritism from the government? Or are you harming people? We would ask that. We do ask that about the energy sector. We think about the healthcare sector in very similar sorts of ways. And in healthcare, the big issue has been efficiencies. Are we really producing our healthcare in the most efficient manner? So these raise ethical questions, and we have philosophical traditions for how we think about some of those ethical questions. However, I want to suggest that while this is a meaningful and important way to think about agriculture, perhaps unlike healthcare or the energy sector, there are long traditions of thinking about agriculture in very dramatically different ways. And I'm going to go through a few bullets just to give you a sense of what some of these are. We might start with Jeffersonian democracy. Jefferson wasn't the only person who came up with this idea. We can see it in Aristotle, for example. But the idea here is that farmers are particularly important as citizens because they derive their economic livelihood and need to be sustainable, need to continue to produce over generations in a way that is much more closely tied to the territory of the nation, right? So in Jefferson's time, we fought this war that you may have heard of. It's called the Revolutionary War. And during the Revolution, many of the manufacturers hightailed it off to Canada or down to the Bahamas. They took their factories with them. They took their capital with them. They left, right? So why did Jefferson like farmers? The farmers didn't have portable capital. They had to stick around and figure out how they're going to make this work, right? So Jefferson gives us this idea that there are intrinsic connections between the farming people of a country and having citizens that really care about making things work. This may be less plausible today than it was in Jefferson's time, but it's given us this sense that it actually is a good thing to have farmers, that farmers bring a certain mentality to our public life that perhaps would not be found among other people, right? This has been given much more of a contemporary twist by Wendell Berry. What Berry would stress is not so much this sense of political solidarity, but he suggests that we need to have some sense of our vulnerability to environmental threats, environmental collapse. We need to understand sustainability in terms of ways in which our daily life binds nature and community together, and that a well-functioning agriculture would serve to make this obvious to everybody. It would actually help people build this into their daily thinking and their habits. Berry says eating is an agricultural act, and according to this view, one of the greatest threats is that people actually don't associate their eating with where the food is coming from or what it takes to produce it. My colleagues in ag economics would be much more comfortable with a notion of agrarianism that suggests that actually there are a lot of things that agriculture provides for us that are not really adequately incentivized by the market system. We really don't trade on landscape preservation, on carbon sequestration. I mean, they talk about trading in that. The way in which agriculture can positively or negatively affect biodiversity. And so we need to be thinking more broadly about agriculture and thinking beyond ways in which the kind of market incentives can produce certain things. This notion that we have a fundamental human right to food, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? That agriculture would be a little different. And if you start to get an agricultural system that where that's a problem, where, for example, there are epidemics of diet-based diseases, or there are major groups of humans that aren't getting enough food, so both sides of this, too much and too little, that there's something wrong with the system and that this is different from, in many respects, other sectors of our economy. And then finally, more straightforwardly, spiritual and religious needs, right? In many spiritual traditions, you see this somewhat in Christianity, you see it really prominently in Asian spiritual traditions. There's this notion that what human purpose is to be this connection point between spirit and matter, or between heaven and earth, and that in some respects we perform this spiritual connection through our agricultural activity. This is going to vary from one religious tradition to another, but it is out there, and it's something that makes agriculture religiously, philosophically different from other areas. Now, I've blown through this really quickly. I don't really suggest that I've done anything other than sort of gesture at this. I'm sure I haven't done enough to convince you to all sign up to be agrarians. I do take all of these notions of agrarianism quite seriously, and really want to try to have a deeper philosophical conversation between these industrial philosophies of agriculture and these agrarian philosophies of agriculture. But I'm here today to talk about gene technologies. And so I want to now finally get on topic a little bit and ask this question, what does any of this have to do with gene technologies? And so if I focus on the industrial side, I think I can actually give you an answer to that. And I think it's consistent with what Dr. McEwen was saying. On the one hand, gene technologies are allowing us to produce what we want from this agricultural platform, and that might be food, but it also might be fuel. It also might be certain, chemicals or biological products that are useful in manufacturing. We'll sort of let the markets sort out which of those things we're going to produce. And it allows us to do that in a more efficient fashion, right? Allows us to use areas where drought would have limited the productive capability. It allows us to use areas where, there are other types of soil contamination. So it's going to improve the efficiency of this process, and it also is going to control the external costs. It's going to maybe fix some of these problems that we have with our current agricultural system, where we're using chemicals that have contaminated water supplies, or where we've started using insecticides that have a negative effect on agricultural workers who are exposed to them, right? So biotech can be very specifically incorporated into this industrial philosophy of agriculture, and the social ethic that guides this philosophy tells us how we should use biotech. When we get over here to this agrarian side, however, I really want to suggest that biotechnology is just orthogonal to agrarian philosophies of agriculture. Here's a great word for you. Go home, right? Use this word in a sentence later today. Orthogonal, right? It just means it doesn't connect up with it. It's sort of going off in another direction, right? Agriculture is going, our agrarian philosophies are going on like this, and biotech's going on. It doesn't connect, right? It could actually be used in ways that would support an agrarian vision. One of these agrarian visions, at least we should be open to that. But it's just not really sort of deeply philosophically connected to these visions. However, and this is what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about, I do think that the current social institutionalization of biotech does threaten some agrarian purposes. Now, what do I mean by a social institutionalization, right? I'm talking about the whole ball of wax, right? Laws, business practices, intellectual property rights, the way in which our scientific organizations are organized, and by that I would include the way we're broken up into departments, and the way in which molecular biologists, I'm the only philosopher they've ever seen, and they've only seen me twice, and my colleagues in the philosophy department, one day I'm working on animal welfare, the next day I'm working on genetic engineering, and then I go do sustainable stuff, and my colleagues in ag say, man, you're a mess, you're all over the place. And I go back to the philosophy, and they say, "You're so narrow. Everything's about agriculture, right?" That's part of our social institutionalization. It's actually the way we've organized our universities, right? But that ties in with the ways that advocacy organizations work, right? Advocacy organizations. There's to put it, a little bit too crudely, if you're going to raise money to support your advocacy cause, you've either got to show lots of pictures of puppy dogs, or you've got to scare the pants off of people, right? And this is may have very little to do with what they're trying to accomplish politically, but it's how we've socially institutionalized this process, right? Our international trade rules, the way the grocery and restaurant industries operate, and I would also include here just this general state of knowledge, the fact that in fact people do know so little about their food, where it comes from, right? That's part of this general social institutionalization that has framed the discussion about biotechnology. So, in a nutshell, agricultural biotechnology has become a divisive social issue, there are very aggressive and committed people, maybe few in the room, and we'd be happy to talk about some of this in the question period, albeit for a relatively small part of the American public. I mean, it's, most people are sort of, what the hell's going on here? Why is everybody so either upset or why are people such boosters of this technology? But once you get sort of inside the nut, it gets to be a pretty hotly debated issue. So I want to suggest that we think of social issues with the metaphor of a constellation, right? There are things that have been important. They have raised more targeted, specific sorts of debates or controversies. And something becomes a social issue when enough of these things seem to be related to one another so that you sort of see it as a thing, right? And, here we have Ursa Major, the bear, but one of the things that's important about constellations is, they can be multiple things depending on which particular bits of the constellation you sort of see as defining the issue. And so what I want to do is to talk in a little more detail about a few of the issues that are out there, right? So Alan's just given you a fantastic talk about what GMOs are. I would stress that there are still two primary applications of this technology, one of which is herbicide tolerance. This is being used in cotton and soybeans especially, but also in corn and some of the other crops. It basically allows you to apply a weed killer to your crop, and it doesn't kill the crop, it just kills the weeds. This is enormously beneficial for farmers. It's really hard it's probably been the most effective weed control technology that's we've ever had. And the second one are usually referred to as BT crops for Bacillus thuringiensis. This is a toxin that kills butterflies and moths. Butterflies and moths we think of as flying around and we like them, right? But butterflies and moths start out their lives as caterpillars, and caterpillars are not the farmer's friend. They do a tremendous amount of damage to crops, right? BT is a organic when it's produced in its normal fashion through a bacterium. It can be applied to organic crops. It's used by organic farmers. It's considered to be an organic method. But when you use genetic engineering to incorporate the ability to produce this toxin in the plant itself, it's no longer organically approved because the Organic Standards Board doesn't approve any genetically engineered crops. And then there are a number of minor applications, and by minor, I just mean that they are relatively small in terms of the number of acres that are grown in comparison with these two big ones here. Dr. McEwen talked about a few of these. And we probably will have more. I have actually gotten to the point where, when I started out doing this stuff, actually I started out this in the 80s. Boy, I'm really getting old. And I used to try to keep up, and I don't even try to keep up anymore. I have no idea. There are probably some new things out there that I don't even know about yet. But we do have a continuing stream of products coming on. But I guess I got to say it's at least 90%, and I probably think it's more like 95% of the applications are still herbicide tolerance and BT. Would you agree with that? Yeah.
I don't know what the figure is, but yeah, the dominant traits are weed control and insect control.
And they are in 3 major crops, corn, soybeans, and cotton. They're also in sugar beets, and again, I'm repeating some of the things that Dr. McEwen has already said. Here's a graphic that shows you how the growth rate in these products has progressed since they were first introduced. The first year in which they were planted with any significant amount was 1997. And as you can see, this is U.S. data, so we're only talking about the United States. And particularly cotton has grown globally, and we would see similar growth rates for that. Some of the food crops have had less uptake even in areas where they are growing genetically engineered crops. What are some of the bright stars in the constellation of the controversy over GM? Now, I'm not going to talk about all of these, but all of these were there were debates that were, all of these points were hotly debated, sometimes for a year or two, sometimes for longer. One of the first ones was Ice minus was a genetically engineered bacterium that was, it was hoped that it would reduce the temperature at which ice would form on a crop. It was significant because it was the technology at which some of the early regulatory court decisions were hammered out. Initially, the decision about whether this should be, whether the scientists should be allowed to conduct experiments was made at the National Institutes of the Health. Not a lot of agricultural scientists at NIH, and so, this was the idea, what the hell are you guys doing with this? And so, it really did kind of shape some of that. But, we had actually a very robust debate over this animal drug called recombinant bovine somatotropin. It's not a genetically engineered animal, it's just a drug, sort of in the same class as insulin, only applied to animals. Actually continues to be controversial in some respect. In the UK, so the British actually had one of the first genetically engineered products on the market. It was a tomato. And they started marketing it in a kind of experiment with Sainsbury's, major grocery store chain in the UK. And, it just was labeled basically with these little cans of tomatoes, and it said product of genetic engineering on it. And they were doing fine. Then one of Sainsbury's competitors started advertising that none of our store brands are genetically engineered. I heard the Sainsbury VP say that they saw a store-wide, this is not just the tomatoes, but a store-wide decline in the sales of their products in the neighborhood of 17% over the course of 2 weeks. And so they figured they better get those tomatoes off the shelf. And they did, right? I could go through each of these, make a note if there's something that you want to talk about, but these were all places where we've had controversy. The most recent ones, a lot of weeds have now become resistant to the herbicides that are used that plants are now resistant to. And so there's some question as to whether or not that technology had the stewardship that it needed. And one of those herbicides is glyphosate, which is, although the debate over glyphosate and its toxicity is not directly related to the genetic engineering, it's certainly true that the use of glyphosate-resistant crops has increased the amount of glyphosate that's getting used. So this often gets represented, especially by opponents of genetic engineering, as if this was a debate that was about genetic engineering, although we do use glyphosate for a lot of other things. So I'm going to move on, but we're happy to talk at more length about some of this. So obviously, this notion that there are this constellation of events, controversies that have shaped opinion on biotech, that stands out against the kind of background, right? And it's certainly true that one of the good things about the herbicide crops is that farmers started using what are considered to be much more benign, less toxic chemicals to control weeds, and BT, it's an organically approved pesticide, should be much safer than some of the pesticides that it was displacing. It's certainly one of the reasons farmers like both of these technologies is that it simplified their management dramatically. Talking to soybean farmers in Indiana when I was on the faculty at Purdue, they would say, now I can go to Florida. I can take my kids to Disney World in the middle of July, and I just couldn't be away from the farm long enough to have done that prior to herbicide-tolerant soybeans, right? And of course, people have made money off of it, right? Farmers use this because they feel like it's profitable for them, and it's obviously been a source of profit for some of the companies that have developed these crops, right? On the other side, you hear comments about gaps in the regulatory system. You hear complaints about labels. This food is not labeled. We now have a law that will eventually require the labeling, although I actually don't feel like it's, what they're doing sounds kind of wacky to me. I'm sure it's not going to make people happy. And then, on the one hand, has this hurt the development of organic agriculture, techniques that would be even better in terms of their reduction? You can go either way. On one hand, it's actually given organic producers a market that they might not have otherwise had. And it's certainly, has similar kinds of relationships in terms of export opportunities in Europe. In parts of the country where you can grow varieties of corn that don't require any genetic engineering, or where you don't get a significant advantage out of that, those farmers are getting a higher price for their corn in European markets. But these have created these contamination debates among farmers. And what if my neighbor's growing a genetically engineered crop? Does that ruin the market value of my organic crop or my non-GM crop? So drilling down to some things that are a little bit more detailed. Now, how have GMOs affected seed practice, right? And one of the big things here is the rapid increase in the importance of utility patents as opposed to some of the older intellectual property rights that used to govern seed practice. We've had registered plant varieties for many years. Registered plant varieties, if you're a plant breeder, you develop a variety, you characterize it in terms of its phenotypic characteristics, would have been the traditional way to do it. And then you get a variety registration. And if somebody wants to grow that variety, or a seed company wants to propagate that variety and sell seed to farmers, they have to get a license from you. And this gives you some income, it gives you some return on your work in developing this variety. However, if there's another plant breeder at a different university or down the road in a different seed company, he can take your variety, or she can take your variety, and build on it. They can add new traits and create yet another variety. And once they've done that, they can license that, and so on and so forth. So you have this ability to sort of build on the varieties, but with utility patents, you have actually two things that are importantly different. One of them is that you actually have to get permission to even do research on a variety that has a utility patent. And so there is the potential to limit the kinds of things that are being done with the work that's already been done. Now, I talk to different people in the plant world. I'm sure Alan has views on this, and some would say this hasn't really been a problem. Companies have been quite willing to give us permission, but at the very least, it's actually wrapped a lot of this up in much more legal costs and apparatus than it previously had. The other big difference between the old system and the new system is that with utility patents, seed companies can prevent farmers from saving and replanting their seed. This means that farmers have to buy new seed every year. This has had zero effect on corn because due to genetic characteristics of corn, you get much higher yields with so-called hybrid varieties, which, and if you save the seed from a corn crop, it's just going to not look anything like the crop that you just grew. So corn growers have been going back and buying seed every year, at least since the 1930s, I guess, is when these really started to come in. However, in soybeans and in cotton, farmers would save seed, and they would clean the seed, and they would at least go a number of years and replant it. And the introduction of utility patents has basically eliminated that. They sign an agreement in order to buy the seed, and the companies won't let them do that. There's a little bit, even a little bit of a loop on this, because although many of the traits that farmers want could be produced without genetic engineering, and in fact, I mean, we're using marker-assisted breeding, which makes use of genomics. Some of them are. Some of the best drought tolerance varieties that we have are actually not really relying on a transgene. But the seed companies will go ahead and stick a transgene in there, and they won't produce a variety that lacks the transgene, because having the transgene in there gives them this kind of control over the technology. So this is kind of an example of what I mean by social institutionalization, right? It's not the science itself, it's not the use of biotech, but the way in which we have chosen to institutionalize this technology has given, it definitely has increased the power of seed companies over producers. And this gets to be an even bigger debate as you start to move outside the United States and highly industrialized agricultural systems, right? Another sort of down in the weeds detail about how this has changed seed practice. You don't even need to be talking about genetic engineering here. Just genomics has really transformed the seed industry into a model that looks much more like what the drug industry has always looked like. I'll try to explain this, right? If you're trying to do work on drugs, right, you basically have this massive effort of trying to identify what certain chemical compounds do. So you're testing thousands of them every day. Does it, raise this or lower that? And then you sort of choose from all of these things a package of things that you develop for your big blockbuster drug. Now, it's important that all of that testing that you're doing, you don't really want the other drug companies to know about that, right? So every drug company is building up this library of compounds that they might develop into drugs, and it's all proprietary, it's all secret, it's not public, right? Whereas in seed production, prior to the biotech era, all of the basic information, what was known, would be shared, it would be published, it would be publicly available. With the introduction of genomics, seed companies have started doing the same thing. They basically, there's billions of genes in any plant, and you start really trying to understand what this gene does and what that gene does. But rather than publishing that information, you keep it secret because you don't want the other biotech company to know what you know. And then you sort of choose the particular genes that you want to develop into products that you would sell. This has actually created much more secrecy and much more private control over the future of the seed industry. It's really made it much more difficult to develop new varieties at places like Michigan State or the University of California. You might, as a scientist, be able to get access to some of this by working very closely with the company and signing non-disclosure agreements and so on and so forth. But it's very much under the control of the companies. And it also has created an incentive for companies to own lots of germplasm. And that has led to this massive consolidation of the of the seed industry. This is a graphic that's put together by Phil Howard, who's one of my colleagues in the Community Sustainability Department of Michigan State. And all of these little circles are seed companies that over 20 years have been purchased by or incorporated into the bigger seed companies. Since Phil made this graphic, Monsanto and Bayer, right, up there and up there, are now actually one, so there's even more concentration than there is shown in this graphic. And we're now in a world where we have a tremendous amount of control of the seed industry by a few companies. One last little graphic. This is the table that it comes from a paper published in 2010, and it summarizes the estimated costs of getting your crop through the regulatory system in order to meet biosafety considerations. Actually, I think so. Biosafety includes both environmental safety but also food safety. And you can see that there's a big column for costs in the U.S., cost in India, and cost in China. I really want to focus on the bottom line down here. According to these economists, the regulatory costs for getting a genetically engineered crop through the U.S. system range between $3 million and $12 million, considerably less than these other countries. But part of the reason for that is that if the U.S. goes first, they don't feel like they need to replicate some of the things that the U.S. has already done. So some of the things that are done in India and in China are things that they want to look at, but that we don't look at so much. But the point that I want to make about this is that you've got to have a lot of money to get a biotech crop on the market. And there are precious few public institutions. By that I mean my university, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's labs, the international research institutes that have the money to take a genetically engineered product through the regulatory system. And this has also put much more control of the products of biotechnology into the hands of this handful of companies that control the seed industry, many of which are also drug companies. And it has, I think, really done a tremendous amount of damage to public sector seed development, which we relied on for a significant. We've always had both a public and a private sector developing seeds, and some of the most valuable ones have come from the private sector. I don't really want to knock capitalism here, but this idea that if you're trying to develop seeds that are going to help farmers, right, and you're going to help farmers that don't have a lot of money, and you want to give them the seeds for free, this model is increasingly less attuned to doing that kind of thing. So I'm going to wrap up, and just with this thought that as a social issue, the way that many, I think, sort of deep in the weeds biotech anti-activists think of it, it's really become defined in terms of profit-seeking, economic development, and the way in which companies oppose new regulations or changes that would weaken their control. And as a result, they bring the same sort of suspicion to the industry that they bring to the energy industry, to the oil companies, or even to the drug companies. And so it has really sort of created this tie-in with for-profit research that's really, I think, at the core of a lot of the most knowledgeable, hardcore anti-GM activists. As I was mentioning earlier, if they're out there trying to win support, they might find it convenient to just scare the pants off of you. But they do have some concerns that they're working with. And I would just conclude with this thought, that not everybody sees this bear. So I'm done. Any... You want to put us together for questions?
Yeah, so why don't you take seats at the table there? And let's have some questions.
So I'm curious about what you all think is the best GMO out there in terms of kind of socially and safety-wise that seems the least harmful to everything. You know what I'm asking? I don't know what I'm asking.
The most impactful?
Yeah, right.
On what, I don't know, are we supposed to turn this on?
Anderson. So, I don't know, maybe not. Your question could be, is there something that's just almost completely benign? And yeah, there probably are. I mean, the papaya, actually, they didn't really have to use any transgenes for the papaya, did they? I thought they were basically, but that was just for markers.
Well, the markers are transgene.
Yes, but the functional genes in the papaya were already in the papaya. It generated resistance, but it it basically would be, you could see anything that's happening in that in a non-GM papaya. But, the ones that have had, I think the one that has had the most positive impact are all of these BT crops, because so far we haven't really seen negative side effects from BT crops. And it has resulted in dramatic reductions of the most toxic pesticides in every crop in which it's been incorporated.
I think I'd answer it a bit differently, and it depends on who you ask. If you ask a farmer, they could well say it's the Roundup Ready herbicide-tolerant crops. That's where they're making the most money. They're using herbicide, Roundup, the glyphosate stuff that's been in the news recently. But farmers say, well, if I wasn't using glyphosate, I would go back to what I was using in the past to control weeds. Farmers have to control weeds or they don't get a profitable crop. And this is part of the equation that really never comes into the public discussion. They just want to get rid of glyphosate. It's dangerous, it's hazardous, causes cancer and so on. Not realizing that farmers are going to have to spray their crops with something. And if it's not glyphosate, which is widely recognized as one of the most benign chemicals ever developed for farm use, they go back to using things like paraquat, which is known to be really nasty. Far worse than Roundup, both in terms of human health effects and environmental effects. I don't want to see farmers go back to that. Now, I also don't want to sell chemicals for the companies. That's not my job. But it would depend. Getting back to your original question, I would say the most impactful GMO is probably insulin.
Yeah, I wasn't even considering medical stuff.
It's a GMO.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, though, the whole Monsanto glyphosate and the Roundup and the seeds and the consolidation of power and that actually just makes it, that amplifies the problem that Dr. Thompson was bringing
Sure,
up.
absolutely. And it's interesting that I've always held, I'm a public scientist, I've always been in the public sector and serving the public interest. I've always held that the healthiest industry is one that has a strong big company component, a strong small company component, and a strong public sector component. It's like the three-legged stool is the most stable. And with the success, the political success of the anti-GMO activists who wanted to get rid of GMOs altogether, but couldn't quite pull that off. Their campaigns were sufficiently successful in knocking out, two of the legs of that stool, leaving behind, really, as Paul mentioned, the big companies and only residual contribution from small companies and public sector. So it was kind of their worst nightmare, right? They've cleared the field for the big companies. The big companies have no competition anymore.
But is that a matter of education then, right? Because if we educate folks to know what argument, so it's not like Dr. Thompson was saying, it's not the technology itself, it's not, so product by product, we should look at product by product, assess it. So how do we get, so my question to both of you then, so how do we get enough education out there so that the scare your pants off thing doesn't happen, but on the other hand, an intelligent conversation of holistic approach does happen?
Well, I would say that, there are, I think I probably contributed to a little misinformation myself. I mean, there are GMO activists who, are genuinely scared. I would say that among I know quite a few of them personally, and I would say that there's that there are no two that are exactly alike, and maybe it's just because it fits with my own views that the ones I feel like I know best and I'm most friends with are the ones that are much more concerned about some of these social and economic issues. But there are definitely GMO activists out there, and some of them are very good scientists. I mean, one of the reasons I sort of worked a little hard to talk about the way in which our sciences are organized is that, some of them are actually, first-rate molecular biologists who've done most of their work in human medicine. And there are things that we do to plants and animals on a routine basis that you would never do to, a human embryo. It would just be considered too great a risk. Dr. McEwen talked about mutation breeding, where you're only interested in that small number that actually turn out well, right? Well, you wouldn't subject human embryos to mutation breeding because you'd be producing lots of very dysfunctional embryos, right? So that's kind of the extreme case, but it really applies to what's done routinely in agricultural genetic engineering. And if you're coming from a research tradition in which you have this rather extreme aversion to the very low probability or significant, any level of probability to an untoward event, you take a very different attitude towards this activity of modifying genes than if your practice is going to be, if something looks like it's weird or not right, you just throw it in the autoclave and forget about it, right? It's not really part of the experiment anymore. So that has actually kind of created, I think, some basis for worries, which it's not like they have no biological basis, but if you have a lot of experience with sorting through lots of different genetic variation in the way that agricultural scientists do, you start to develop a certain amount of confidence in terms of your ability to pick out the winners and get rid of the losers. And this is just not something that's done in some areas of the science. So I think it actually, there are ways in which, you talk about education, but even among very highly educated people, there are just not the conversations that would need to happen to sort of develop, I think, a kind of, agreement about, what's actually being done here.
My take on this is, Paul alluded earlier that people don't understand where the food comes from in the first place. And this is the biggest problem that I see when I talk to a group, particularly urban people, and I ask them, how many of you grew up on a farm? Usually very few hands go up. If you look at the U.S. Census data from the early 20th century, it took over 40% of our population to produce food, either directly on the farm or indirectly post-farm. Now it's 2%. So there's a huge gap there between what people had familiarity with in the past and today in terms of farming and food production. And people have very romantic notions of farming, right? I mean, you ask people to conjure up a farm, and they think of old MacDonald with a few chickens and a little kitchen garden and a pig, and that never existed. It never existed. That was never our farming model. Farming is a very messy business. It always has been. It's getting less messy. And when you look at the changes introduced into a genome through genetic engineering, it's actually far less disruptive doing a gene transfer, recombinant DNA, than a traditional cross, which is what most people think of as traditional plant breeding. The changes in the genome, beyond the trait that you're interested in as a plant breeder, are far greater in conventional breeding methods than they are with genetic engineering. But that's what many people are frightened of, these off-target effects. And it is part of the education. I do agree with Paul that the anti-GMO activists are not a homogeneous mass who all agree and are equally in agreement on the approach, which is to scare the pants off people. There's a political objective, a political agenda there very often. They know what the facts are, but they're not going to get the support they're seeking unless they scare the pants off people, talking about the potential hazards with GMO foods. And the scientific community has gone beyond that. I mean, the studies, I mentioned 1,700 scientific studies looking at the broad range of potential hazards with GMOs, and virtually every one of them concluding that they're no different with genetic engineering compared to conventional breeding. Again, I hasten to add, this isn't the same as saying there's no risks or they're perfectly safe, but we have the regulatory system to weed out those potentially hazardous products. We have a very successful track record of getting rid of potentially hazardous food products from breeding before they get to the market to harm consumers. Keeping that method in place is probably the right policy. We've never had to withdraw a GMO from the market for health safety reasons. We have had to withdraw conventionally bred varieties. Rarely, but it does happen. So, going back, it's the education is key. If only people understood what farming is like in the first place, before we get to biotechnology or genetic engineering, that would provide the foundation that we could then have a far more nuanced and informed discussion of where should we go with biotechnology, which applications should we embrace, which ones should we put on the back burner.
So, I guess my question is, if it's not based in science, and we have these 1,700 published studies showing safety profiles, what is the basis? I know this is a very simple question, but I've never been able to answer it for myself. What is the basis for the people that are opposed to genetically modified products?
So, I mean, I do think that the extent to which there's a scientific basis, it is that these techniques produce what Alan was referring to as off-target effects. They perform the transformation that they were designed to perform, but they also may be tied to other changes in the genome, right? Now this gets back to but this is true of all agriculture comment, right? If you know that about genetic engineering, but you don't know that in fact ordinary plant breeding crosses have those kinds of impacts, and you don't know that in fact cell culture probably is a much greater source, which is not considered to be genetic engineering, is a greater source of these off-target effects. But the fact that, Alan also talked about dramatic changes that are tied to just 6 base pairs. So it's entirely feasible that one of these off-target effects could do something, that would be really harmful. So it's not a fantasy to think that could happen. And the question is, does the experience, I think that in a certain sense this comes down much more to experience than to theory. I'm speaking as a philosopher now. The experience that agricultural scientists have with sort of sorting through a lot of changes and not paying attention, basically just dumping the ones that they don't want, has given them confidence that they are pretty good at finding the winners, right? And they've got, if you want to take it back to breeding, they've got centuries of experience doing this. And so I tend to accept their argument, right? But if you're coming at this from the standpoint of knowing enough molecular biology to know that, very small changes in a gene sequence can have dramatic effects, and here you're doing something that can introduce changes that you can't anticipate or predict and you don't know where that's going to happen, that's enough to I think, make you a little worried. So I think the ones that are genuinely concerned about safety are kind of coming at it from that perspective. Even within the agricultural sciences, one of the things that I think my position has done is that there's a certain sense in which I talk to so many different groups in the agricultural sciences, but I had a conversation with a very distinguished, well-known weed scientist who was not aware that we had bred crops that cross species lines, which is kind of a pretty basic thing if you're in plant breeding, right? Very good scientist, no question about it. But it's just and he was a plant scientist, right? But it just wasn't part of his background knowledge, right? So, kind of what you do know and what you don't know and how all that comes together. I think that, there's a community out there. And I guess if I had to say what's the issue, we've never had a forum in agriculture where these things really get hashed out. And if I could get up, I'll try to do this really briefly. Part of my soapbox is that if we look at what's happened in the medical world, we've created bioethics as the forum where this stuff gets hashed out. And I was getting started in my work about the same time that many medical bioethics were getting started. I was maybe 8 or 10 years late. But in 1980, when I got hired to do this at Texas A&M, not every medical school had a bioethicist. Now there's no medical school that doesn't have a department of bioethics with 8 or 10 people working at various aspects of this. And so there's a certain sense in which the agricultural, the institutions of agriculture have just not been either able or willing to invest in that kind of a capability.
My take on your question is that there are people who have an agenda that they know it won't work if they're completely honest with it. Right? If they hate capitalism, they don't like GMOs because the whole industry is dominated by these big multinational companies. And if they go to the public saying we have to destroy these big companies, they don't get a lot of traction. Right? I mean, there's certain people who do adhere to that political position. But they do get support if they say, hey, these things could be really dangerous to your health. Then people perk up and listen. And then they bring in these specious arguments, not entirely specious, but off-target effects could cause the production of toxins that weren't there before. Well, conceivably that's true, but under normal plant breeding practice, the breeders measure toxins long before consumers get anywhere near it, right? Very early years, standard procedure, conventional breeding, genetic engineering, doesn't matter. Those things are already done because we know on occasion, on rare occasion, it does happen. I mean, virtually everything we grow, everything we eat, has these things that we in the industry call euphemistically anti-nutritional components. Yeah. Poisons, toxins that are naturally present that we haven't been able to eliminate entirely, but we eat them every day in every meal. In small doses, they don't do any harm. So we have to monitor, we breeders have to monitor to make sure we didn't inadvertently increase the levels of those anti-nutritional compounds in the final product. So it's a routine analysis. The regulatory system is already in place. As I said, it's, the track record is extremely good. Rarely have we had to remove a food developed from a crop through a process of plant breeding, whether conventional or genetic engineering, has never been done. The system works. You put it that way.
one more question. I think we're a little over time, but you guys.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Where do you foresee the debate over the controversy, or maybe put that in quotes, controversy with GMOs, going in the next few years? Because it almost feels like to me, if you look back 5 years ago, a lot of people were talking about it. It was all over the news. There's a lot of misinformation out there. I think it was a lot more on people's radar. And now it almost feels like GMOs have gotten so omnipresent. It's like maybe a little bit of that fear has gone away. And I feel like it's something that's the general public, if it's something complex like that, either they're going to kind of be afraid of it because they don't understand it, or they'll ignore it because they don't understand it. And when you think about like something like cell phones, a few years ago, everyone was like, oh, you're going to get brain cancer from using a cell phone, but when's the last time you thought about that? Because they're just omnipresent. So I guess what do you think the kind of taking the pulse on people at this point is? Does that all make sense?
I'll take that one first.
Okay.
You can only scare the pants off people for so long before they get attenuated and they say, well, hold it now. You've been telling me this for 20 years, right? We've been eating these GMOs since 1996. There's still not a single documented case of harm. When are we going to see the impacts? So I think here in the US and Canada, it's largely passed, and particularly getting the support of the scientific community saying, look, there's really no additional health risks with GMOs above and beyond what we see with conventional foods. People here still trust USDA and FDA to a large degree that they don't in Europe. I think we're going to see, though, the debate shifting much more to Africa and Asia, where, here, until people are dropping dead in the street, we have lots of food in the marketplace. It's still affordable. It's not going to get the same traction. The opposition arguments, particularly pertaining to safety, just don't have the same effect here anymore. They do still in parts of Africa and Asia, where the technology really can make a dramatic difference in overcoming, true nutritional deficiencies. When the golden rice comes out later this year, and things like the BT brinjal in Bangladesh, which is now in production for the last couple of years, with no harms, with a very dramatic reduction in the amount of pesticides used to grow, that staple crop in that country. People are going to start having a more informed and vital debate there. And these questions and the discussion is going to be much more vigorous there than it is here, where it's going to be ho-hum, I think.
So I would actually say that there is a pretty robust debate. It's kind of an insider debate right now over gene editing and whether or not it's going to be regulated, how it's going to be regulated. The Europeans seem to be making very different decisions than our regulatory agencies are making, and so that's eventually going to hit one another when we get into international trade. Whether or not that rises to the level of, the reader of the New York Times, or, it becomes viral on the internet, maybe not, right? The things that I think are more likely to be significant are gene drives. We didn't talk about gene drives today, but I'm doing some work on genetically engineered mosquitoes. Right now, the primary applications are public health applications, but we're talking about using it basically as a mechanism that's actually intended to spread through the naturally breeding population. It doesn't work unless it does that. And that's, I think, generating a lot of discussion and will scare the pants off people. And then, gosh, I had a third one. I may have forgotten it now. Yeah, probably. Maybe let's just forget about the third one.
Thank you very much.